Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be able to talk to you. And the title of this is How Anyone Can Become a Master Apologist. And I think what I do need to say to you is the very famous story about the person who arrived in New York City and asked, how do I get to the Carnegie Hall? And the answer was, practice. And in many ways, that is what I'm saying to you tonight, I'm afraid, that telling stories is a wonderful way of doing apologetics, but you need to practice it. I very much hope that I'll be able to get some good lines of thought beginning this evening. So, apologetics has changed over time. It's changed partly because the situation has changed, and it's changed also because people have realized there are different ways of doing this. And certainly, if you look at American apologetics in the early 20th century, very much the idea of simply arguing people into the kingdom of God. The role of apologetics is to develop arguments that persuade people that Christianity is true so that they will embrace it. And I want to say from the beginning how important arguments are. There's no way anything I'm going to say this evening diminishes their importance. You need to know what can be said to those who want to offer critiques of Christianity. And happily, there are many very, very good things that you can say. But it's not the only way. And one of the things we have seen in the 20th century is the growing realization of the importance of telling stories in apologetics. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened for many reasons. And one of them, I think, is the growing realization that stories appeal to people's imaginations, that that arguments, frankly, can be really rather dull, but stories very often are much more interesting. And two of the early pioneers of narrative apologetics are G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy L. Sayers. And both of these writers, I have to tell you, wrote detective novels. And you think about what detective novels are all about. G.K. Chesterton wrote the Father Brown novels, and Dorothy L. Sayers wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey novels. And in each case, these are stories of people who encounter events that need to be explained. Who did the murder? What are the clues? How can we begin to assemble these? What is the best explanation of the evidence? And the narrative is that of people putting together the clues to find what the best explanation is. And so you can see immediately how there's a parallel here between detective fiction and apologetics. It's all about trying to identify the clues and work out what they mean. And so I think it's very natural to move on to the whole idea of narrative apologetics, which is in effect not so much producing arguments as picking up on the biblical theme of stories. And what I want to do in this talk is begin to explore different kinds of stories, but I want to begin by asking, why has this approach been so successful? And I think one of the reasons is that it really does engage with things at a deeper level. That in effect there's something that a story is able to capture people's imagination, to hold their interest in a way that a pure rational argument is not. But one of the people who's really done a lot to increase interest in apologetics using stories is J.R.R. Tolkien. And I want to talk about him a little bit because Tolkien sees this as being a God-given gift. In other words, it's something which we are meant to use. And the point that Tolkien makes is that the stories that we tell in trying to make sense of our lives are based on the ultimate story of God, the great drama of creation and redemption and final consummation. And Tolkien's argument is that very often we're able to tap into people's subconscious and in effect achieve connections with our origins in God. And we can use stories to kind of way re-establish these connections. So Tolkien, I think, is a very important influence on writers like C.S. Lewis, who have developed this narrative approach to apologetics. But I want mainly to talk about Lewis, and I want to ask, how did Lewis come to appreciate the apologetic role of stories? And so I'm going to take you back to an earlier period in history, which is England in the 1890s. And we're looking at a young writer of science fiction called H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells wrote a number of very popular science fiction novels, such as The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. And these were, in effect, science fiction novels which told stories that really captured people's imaginations, but at the same time promoted this message: science is the future, that science is going to be able to sort everything out. So what H.G. Wells was doing here was using novels as a way of promoting what you might loosely call evolutionary optimism. And C.S. Lewis loved reading H.G. Wells' stories. As a boy, he enjoyed reading The Time Machine, he enjoyed reading The War of the Worlds, but he did not like the worldview that they communicated. And Lewis began to think thoughts like this: narratives are great, stories are great. What if I were to use stories to develop a worldview which is very different from that of H.G. Wells? And so Lewis developed this idea of using narrative stories like H.G. Wells, but using them to articulate and defend a worldview which was very, very different from that of H.G. Wells. In other words, it's about defending the Christian worldview. And that, I think, is very helpful because it does explain why Lewis wrote novels like the science fiction trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. But here's the point I want to make. One of the issues Lewis wants to bring out very clearly is that very often we use science in very bad ways. And Lewis simply makes the point this is part of human nature. We take things that are good or neutral and very often use them in very bad ways. And Lewis explored this idea in his 1943 book, The Abolition of Man. Some of you will have read this, but my suspicion is not that many, because it's one of Lewis's least popular writings. And the reason it's not very popular is it's a difficult argument. And Lewis realized very quickly that the book was not selling very well, and wanted to try and explore its ideas in a form that would capture the public imagination. And so he wrote a novel which in effect expressed the ideas of the abolition of man in narrative form. And that was the book, That Hideous Strength, which was published in the middle of August 1945. And it really achieved a lot of public interest. The theme of this book is that science can go wrong, that it can be abused, that it can imprison people, that it can be used to do things which we shouldn't be doing. And one key point that Lewis made is maybe science is crossing borders, which once you've crossed them, you cannot go back. In other words, we're now able to do certain things, and now that we can do them, we can't undo that. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, was published on the 10th of August, 1945. And earlier that month, for the very first time, atom bombs were used in warfare. 2 of them were dropped in Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Lewis's book appeared shortly after that, and it became a bestseller. Why? Well, partly because it was a very well-written story, but partly because people were saying, Lewis is identifying a real problem. What happens if we start doing things and can't undo what we have achieved? Can we uninvent atomic bombs? So it began to become clear to Lewis that stories were an ideal way of exploring difficult questions. It gave readers the imaginative space to begin to think things through. So that's what we find in the Chronicles of Narnia. And what I want to do is begin to explore with you what Lewis is doing in these novels, because he's not simply telling a story, he's doing something much more interesting. What Lewis does in the Chronicles of Narnia is tell stories that really intrigue people. Whether you are a Christian or not, you will enjoy reading the Chronicles of Narnia. They're beautifully written, especially, I think, the second volume in the series, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that, of course, was the first one to be published. The Magician's Nephew came later. So what is Lewis doing in the Chronicles of Narnia? Here's what I want to suggest is happening. I'm going to begin with focusing on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because that is the most popular, I think, in the series, and it makes these points particularly clearly. Here's the first point I want to make. You all remember reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The children enter into this mysterious world of Narnia, and they wonder, where is this? What is this? And as they begin to explore Narnia, they hear stories about it. Some say this is the realm of the White Witch. It's hers. Others say, no. This is the realm of Aslan. He's not here at the moment, but when he comes back, everything is going to be different. And the children who go in have to make this decision. Which story is right? Which story is interpreting Narnia correctly? And so they begin to develop ways of checking out how you might compare and evaluate the different stories that they are hearing. And of course, there's some very important questions like, what is the evidence? Are the people who are telling these stories trustworthy? Or are they people that you can't trust? And Lewis is trying to make the point, we live in a world where we hear multiple stories about who we are, multiple stories about what kind of world this is. Is it, like Richard Dawkins says, a world that has evolved completely by chance? Or is it the realm of a creator God who has made it and made us to live here for a given purpose? And Lewis, I think, is beginning to help us see how we have to learn to wrestle with stories about who we are and what life is all about. So that's a very important point to make clear. But here's the second point, and this is really important in relation to narrative apologetics. If you think of the four children, each of them has their own individual story, and that story is precious, it's unique, it's what defines them as children. And as they begin to realize what Narnia really is all about, as they discover Aslan, as they discover where Narnia has been and where Narnia is going to go, they begin to realize that each of their individual stories can become part of this greater story of Narnia. In other words, by entering into this and becoming part of this, they achieve meaning and value by becoming part of a bigger story. Now, I'm sure there's some psychologists in this audience tonight, and you will know the research that shows that human beings very often find meaning when they sense there is a bigger picture, there's a grander story, and realizing they can step into this bigger story, this bigger picture, and become part of it, not losing their identity, but rather becoming more significant, becoming part of a bigger story which they move ahead. And that is what Lewis does in the Chronicles of Narnia. He shows how these children are able to gain significance and purpose and meaning by stepping into the story of Narnia and bringing their own distinct gifts to bear on its future. Now, I think that's very important and actually very helpful, because it does really give us a very helpful way of thinking about coming to faith. Coming to faith is about accepting the story, stepping into it, becoming part of it, and in doing so we find meaning, we find value, we find purpose. And Lewis brings that out very clearly. So Lewis is making quite a lot of points here. One of them is stories attract us. Let me give you an example. How many of you here have read the Da Vinci Code? Don't worry, yes, quite a few of you. Okay, now I'm one of them, and as I read this book by Dan Brown, which is very anti-Christian, I have to say, I began reading and thinking, oh my goodness, he's got things wrong here, he doesn't understand Christianity, I'll just turn over the page, see what happens next, oh dear, he's got the Council of Nicaea wrong, oh dear. And what I found was, I just keep going, and what was happening was the narrative had captured my imagination, and I kept reading, I kept going into it. And that is what good stories do for you. And what Lewis is saying is this: why hand over to Dan Brown? Why allow secular stories to be told when Christians have their own story to tell? And so I want to say to you that C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and in its own way, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, are very powerful stories which bring out what is distinctive about human nature and also the Christian vision of how we're able to relate to God and be transformed as a result. So that, I think, is really quite important. So moving on from there, I think we have to say that the new importance of this point is that narratives now are hugely important. If you think of narratives, we see them in novels, we see them in the movies, where very often a story will capture somebody's imagination. And Lewis's point is, we have a very good story to tell, and we need to tell that story. So let me go back to Lewis's sermon of 1941. I mentioned this in an earlier talk for those of you who are here, and this is the sermon, The Weight of Glory. The Weight of Glory. It's a very powerful title. It comes from the English poet John Donne. Glory is something that overwhelms us. It's heavy. And it really just simply overwhelms us because we can't cope with it. But here's the point that Lewis makes in this very powerful sermon. He says, we live in an age which has been taken captive by a dominant story. And the story that has gained cultural dominance is that what you see is what you get. There is nothing beyond the material world. And Lewis says that this, in effect, has captured the imagination of our culture. And Lewis's question to his audience in Oxford in 1941 was this: how can we break the spell of this story? This story is dominant. What can we do to break its power? And Lewis's answer is this: to break the power of a secular story, you need to tell a better story. A story that also captures the imagination, that makes more sense of life than its rivals, and is able to offer a vision for who we are, what we are really meant to be, and what we can do. And so for Lewis, stories were of enormous importance. Here's what Lewis says. I'm quoting now from that sermon. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness that has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. So Lewis is really saying we need to tell the Christian story. We need to captivate people's imaginations. We need, in effect, to really show people there is an alternative. And one of the many merits of narrative apologetics is that it gives each of us a very significant role. And I'll come back to this in a moment. And what I'm going to say to you is that you do not need to be good at arguments to do apologetics. You need simply to be able to tell your own story and reflect on its significance. Now, I'll come back to that later in this lecture. But I want to suggest to you that apologetics is a bit like medicine. It's both an art and a science. The science, if you're a medic, is knowing what all the drugs are, knowing how all the body's organs work. But the art is working out what is wrong with somebody and working out what the best medication might be. And that means somebody who's able to talk to patients, read them, discover what is really the problem. And you know, apologetics is a bit like that too. It's a science and an art. The science is knowing the arguments, the resources we can use, but the art is trying to work out what difficulties the people we are talking to are experiencing, allowing us to work out what the best way of meeting these concerns is. And apologetics, I think, really is both an art and a science, and it means being able to work out both what the problem is, but also what the best way of dealing with it is. So one of the questions I want to ask is this: if apologetics involves stories, then what stories might we tell? So I want to explore that with you now, because that seems to me to be a very interesting and very important point. And I'm going to suggest there are a number of these that might actually be very helpful. I suggest that we might think of using biblical stories. I'm going to suggest we might think of telling our own stories. And of course, you might draw on stories that are well known in our culture. So let's look at each of those. What biblical stories might we draw on? Scripture is rich in stories, so we have a lot to choose from. Well, we might think of, for example, the biblical story of the exile of the people of Jerusalem in Babylon. And you all know this story. The people of Jerusalem are deported to Babylon. They stay there. They want to go home. They long to be in Jerusalem, not in Babylon, by the waters of Babylon. There we cried while we remembered Jerusalem. You know, that's a very, very powerful theme. They're in exile, the people of Jerusalem. And you can tell that story and then use it to explain what Christianity is all about. It's a bit like we are in exile in this world. This isn't where we really belong. We believe we belong in the New Jerusalem, but we're here at the moment, and one day we're going to go home. But in the meantime, there are things we can do here which really matter. So what you are doing there is sketching an understanding of what the human situation is. You're in effect saying this is not where we really belong, but we are here for the meantime, but we are going home one day, and that gives you a framework for beginning to make sense of life. Or you might think of parables. You might think, for example, of the parable of the pearl of great price. It's a very short parable. It's in Matthew 13. And many of you will know this story very, very well. There is a merchant who clearly knows a good thing when he sees it. And he sees this pearl. It is precious, it's valuable, and he realizes nothing else satisfies him. He will have to sell everything he has to possess it, but this is what he really wants. So you see here a narrative you can use to explore the human longing for something that really satisfies. And many of you will know this experience. It's very, very commonplace. What is the heart's desire? And very often involves a realization that there is something really significant we're all looking for. We haven't found it yet, but when we do, we will be deeply satisfied, and it is worth waiting for. And of course, that is a very powerful way of explaining what the Christian faith is all about. It is something that speaks to us, that connects with us, that satisfies our deepest longings and gives us a new vision of life. And those of you who enjoy reading Augustine of Hippo, the 5th century Christian theologian, will know his very famous prayer, which goes like this: "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you." And that's all about coming home to God, finding God. In other words, realizing that God is the one we've been looking for, the one who is really able to satisfy those deepest longings. But the other story you might tell is your own story. And this is a very important point. I could tell you my story. You know, it's all about someone who once was a very aggressive, very convinced atheist, who began to realize there were vulnerabilities with my own position. Then went up to Oxford University and encountered articulate Christians who were able to show me that I had not really understood what Christianity was, and that Christianity had this richness and intellectual depth which was far greater than that of atheism. And that all became part of my story as I moved from atheism to Christianity. Now, I quite often tell that story. I'm not going to do it now because I want to make a slightly different point, which is in this audience tonight, we have many stories that need to be told. And some of them may be stories of discovering Christianity. Some of them may be stories of having, grown up within Christianity and gradually coming to appreciate its deep appeal, its rich vision of life, and all these things. And your story could be pivotal. It could be a turning point for somebody who's listening to you. And so I just want to ask you this question. I want you to realize you are not being immodest or arrogant or proud in thinking that your story is important and interesting. What I want you to realize is your story might well speak to someone who realizes that helps me. That enables me to see what's wrong and what can be done about it. So I want you to think about this. If you were to tell your own story, what apologetic significance would it have? How might it help somebody else who is thinking about these things to move forward in their journey of discovery? But here's the really important thing. I want to draw a distinction between being true and being real. And the point I want to make is something can be true but not have any relevance to life. It's not enough to persuade somebody that something is true. You need to be able to show that it's relevant and life-changing. Here is an absolutely secure truth. You can be sure this is right. 2 and 2 make 4. Now that's right. It's true. But I want to suggest to you that truth is no guarantee of relevance. Sure, it's important to believe things are true, but truth in itself isn't enough. When you tell your story, it's about how Christianity is real for you. Not just true, real. It makes a difference to you. It gives you a sense of purpose, identity, direction, a sense of hope. And these are really important things. And when you tell your story, you're in effect conveying to the person you're talking to that this could also be their story, the discovery of hope, meaning, significance, and purpose. So I want to invite you just to think about that. What might your story say to somebody who is wondering what life is all about or what Christianity is all about? That seems to me to be very, very important indeed. So narratives, I think, are really helpful in thinking about faith. So who might you be reading to take this further? Well, obviously, I've written a book called Narrative Apologetics, which talks about this a little bit. But the really important people are people like C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, G.K. Chesterton. These are all English writers, but they have mastered the art of narrative apologetics. And so I want to suggest you can learn from them. And it will not be a burden. It will be, I think, a blessing for you to begin to read them and think about them. But here is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Let's take Dorothy L. Sayers, a very able Christian writer who was propelled to fame during the 1930s by detective novels, and for a while she was up there with Agatha Christie as one of the leading female detective novelists of her age in England. Here's what Dorothy Sayers says about why narrative apologetics is so important. She says, we all want to make sense of our lives and of our world. And so what we do is we assemble clues and we try to figure out what the best explanation is. And then she makes this really interesting point. That's why detective fiction is so important, so popular, because in effect there's something about human beings that makes us want to try and find the meaning in the clues. And today, of course, I mean, what Finnish television is like, but in British television, we have all these TV crime series which are, in effect, saying, here are the clues, what do they mean? And basically, Sayers realized that what she could do is show how we connect the dots, the clues, and arrive at a conclusion. And so Dorothy Sayers saw crime fiction as being really powerful, appealing to people's imaginations, but also showing them how they could make sense of life by putting the clues together and finding what they really meant. So you might be using other forms of writing. Marilynne Robinson is a very good example of a recent female writer who doesn't write crime fiction, but very often writes biographical or historically based fiction, which very much is about trying to understand how people function and, of course, also what life is all about. And she's a very good example of a writer who uses fiction to help people to grasp how significant religious faith is to people and how it informs their life decisions, gives them hope in very difficult times. So what I'm saying to you is that detective fiction is a very good example of this, but it goes far wider than this. So let me begin to wrap things up. We have time of questions, so I'm very happy to take this further. But the main point I want to make is to emphasize how important your story might be. If there's one thing you remember from my talk tonight, it's my question to you: how might your story be helpful apologetically? So you know your own story. Just think about that. How might it help somebody else think through questions of meaning and purpose and value? And now we come to the theological point that I really want to make. And it's this. This is very relevant throughout the whole field of apologetics. And it's this. Many of you here tonight will probably be saying, well, this is all very well and very good, but I'm not sure I can rise to this task. I think apologetics is a very good thing, but I'm not sure that I can do it. I'm not sure that I'm good enough to be able to really deliver the kind of thing you're looking for. Now, if that's what you're thinking, I want you to listen to me, because I want to say some things in this last talk I'm giving here today, and that is that we are dealing with a God who knows precisely who we are, who knows our strengths and our weaknesses. But by God's grace, we are able to rise to these challenges. We're not doing it in our own strength. We're rather doing it in the presence and power of the God who raised Christ from the dead and is able to give us his strength as we try to engage these tasks. And you will all know that the Bible is full of characters who felt that they were inadequate and then discovered that God gave them the resources that they needed to rise to this challenge. So what I want to say to you very simply is this, that you can make a difference. It may be that you are not giving an apologetic lecture, you're simply talking to your friends. But very often, those conversations can plant the seeds of a future faith. Now, I've mentioned this point before, but I want to come back to this. I know many people who've come to faith, often over an extended period of time, because of something that their friends once said to them that has remained with them, and they kept coming back to it. It kind of was like a seed that had been planted. And they kept thinking about it and said, I now see where this is taking me, I now want to take that step of faith. So maybe apologetics is like planting seeds. You don't necessarily take people all the way in their journey of faith, but maybe you plant a seed that might be helpful. Maybe you move away a roadblock. There are many others, but you've done something that will help them on that road. So I just want to say to you that this is really important. Even in my own case, I can point to people who really helped me on the road to faith, even though they didn't realize exactly what they're doing. They're simply talking about their faith, helping me to understand what it really was in the face of my caricatures of faith. And I believe you could do this as well. So I just want to say to you, think about this. This is something where you may be able to do more than you realize. But let me now wrap up on this theme of narrative apologetics. Apologetics is a very rich discipline. It's about using an appeal to reason, to imagination, to the feelings, using stories, and engaging people at different levels. Why? Well, because Christianity is so rich. And one of the things I've discovered in my own journey of faith is that actually very often it's by doing apologetics that I've discovered just how rich and resilient Christianity actually is. It's been very helpful to me because when I ask myself, how can I explain this idea, or how can I help this person connect with faith, it helps me think about the depth and the richness of faith. And that, I think, is something that's very important. So there's a richness there. I want to suggest to you that doing apologetics actually is a good way of deepening and enriching your own faith. But of course, the main reason for doing apologetics is simply this is something that needs to be done. In the first letter of Peter, we find this very important injunction, which is, in effect, always be willing to give a reason for the hope that is within you. A reason for the hope. Talk about your faith. Talk about the difference it makes to you and how it might make sense to other people as well. But the key point here simply is this. You don't need to be a professional apologist. Very often, in your own way, you'll be able to talk about the difference that faith makes to you, the difference it could make to someone else. And so really the take-home message I want to leave with you is that how important apologetics is, and how indeed we do need professional apologists, but that actually all of us have a role to play in this. All of us have a story to tell, a story of coming to faith or a story of growing in faith. And for somebody else, that could be transformative. Just think, what could you do? And I gladly leave that question with you for further thought. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to me. I'm now very happy to take questions.